So Wicker is an add-on that lets you take any object you want and make a Wicker woven pattern on its surface, which is really hard to do yourself, so that's why I made this add-on. If you have it installed, you're going to see nothing in the end panel until we select an object and then it shows up. Object, make it a Wicker object. It's literally that simple. And at this point, you can just kind of leave it be if you wanted. It has a material that you can edit, etc. But if you want to go into the settings and all this, this is what this tutorial is for. So the first thing to understand is this is kind of a geometry nodes group. What that means is if you want to edit this Wicker, you're going to use all of these parameters over here. And before we get deep into these, I just want you to note the first thing is a UV map. Why? Well, this is a UV dependent effect, which is actually great because here's the UV unwrap for a cube. I can edit kind of the weaving pattern based on this. So by rotating it 45 degrees, I get a diagonal pattern. I can make it denser. I could even move individual faces, right? And the deformation stays. So it is a UV dependent effect, and that matters because sometimes if you have issues, it's because your UVs have issues. So make sure this UV map is named your actual UV map, which by default is that. Other things that are super simple. Resolution is how much detail this gets, right? So how much geo does it get? You could keep it low, pick your settings, and then make it higher. Density is kind of similar to scaling this up and down. By the way, with your unwrap, you want to make sure it's contained within the square. As you can see, it runs into issues, and also make sure there's no overlap. Density is very similar to that, where I can make it sparser or I can make it denser. If I make it super dense, like 100, you're going to see that there's all this like overlapping and the strands are too thick, which is where these other three sliders come in, which are basically the shape of it. Particularly, I care about the width. As I bring down the width, you're going to see we get those individual strands again. The thickness is the other dimension, so how thick is it? And then the height is how far off the surface does it go. And this is what lets you make a more tightly woven pattern if you wanted to. So all of these things play in tandem where you need to pick these settings, pick an unwrap that matches your scene, etc. The last thing I haven't mentioned is this cull slider. This is more so of a debugging thing if you have a really tricky mesh. But because this is UV dependent, what that means is I can model and do whatever as long as it is reflected in the UV map. So you can see it's doing pretty good until I bring this too high, and that's because the UV gets kind of tight and broken here. Very easy fix. At any time, you can just do a new unwrap. So smart UV project, boom. Now it's kind of a even density, which we can make sparser. So that's kind of the beauty of the workflow. You get a mix of being able to model fully dynamically, and at any time you can edit the unwrap. Like, for example, if I didn't like the placement of this, you could get weird with it. But as you can see, normally it's best to unwrap. So it's dynamic. Let's do one more example. I'm going to inset. I'm going to extrude. I mean, that pretty much works, except you see there's a bit of a gap of air. And that makes sense because we made some new faces with this extrusion that don't exist yet. So again, smart UV project or any kind of projection you want. And now you can see these are once again contained. Let's make that sparser. Okay. This works on absolutely any mesh, these principles. So let's try something a bit more interesting. A cylinder. This is super low resolution, yet when I Wicker it, comes out great once I pick the settings I like. So let's make that a bit sparser. And I think the top and bottom are denser than the actual thing. So I'm just going to take these sections, scale those down, and very quickly you get a nice effect. If you want a bit of roll off, you can kind of bevel this here, and that will make it follow the contour a bit better. And again, it's fully UV dependent. So if you don't like the seam over here, you could just unwrap it differently so that there is no seam. And everything works the same. So we can make a nice tight unwrap, whatever. And again, I want to mention that this works with deformation, as you can see. So what that means is you can do something like, let's do a sphere. Let's do an icosphere with the Wicker thing. And let's do another effect where we have the wave modifier. So the wave, of course, works after this effect. That's fine, but it also works before. Okay, so what I mean is any deformation, if you have a rigged character for some reason made out of Wicker, like a Wizard of Oz thing, that will work, right? There are kind of more complicated cases where that's why there's the UV unwrap thing, so you can debug, where it takes a bit longer, right? So let's say I have a monkey over here. The unwrap is not the best, but let's make it a Wicker object. It does a pretty good job initially, but there's some problems, right? The ear is too dense, like the shape is too overlapping. So I think the first thing we do is we'd say we need a new unwrap. Like we can, you know, take an ear and play with it and see what happens. But what I would recommend is either do a smart UV project, which usually works great. And if you don't like that because there's too many islands, you could try using some of the new minimum stretch methods, which work pretty well. It tends to give a pretty normal density. Whatever you feel like looks the best. So I'm going to bring the density down, or no, I'm going to keep it up but bring down the width, and then bring down the height so it's a bit of a tighter weave. And this is an effect that would be so hard to do yourself. Now, if you have super detailed geometry, you might see some breaking, and that is what this cull thing is that I don't think I talked about much. Generally, you don't touch this, but sometimes it will let you kind of wiggle the mesh in a way that might make better generations. So sometimes that's kind of like a Hail Mary over there. But let's do a project, Smart UV project. Make those islands smaller. Honestly, I like just editing in the UV editor over anything else. And there you go. Let's make it a bit wider. Maybe a bit higher resolution since there's a lot of contouring. That looks pretty good. Additionally, you can smooth it out. So I'm not going to subdivide the, the wicker itself, but the mesh. So make sure this happens first. View it. And now this is without, this is with, and as you can see, 100% dynamic because it comes with the UV map. And if you get any breaking, either update the cull. So here's a good example where it actually fixes things. Yeah, but I wanted it to be as close to a one-click solution. So generally, other than picking your density, it's just kind of good to go from the get-go. So thanks for watching. Hopefully it makes sense.